Welcome to another episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I am your host, Mark Hasera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been aviation. I flew KC-135s for 24 and a half years in the Air Force, passing gas all over the world. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we debrief some of the most intriguing and fascinating pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. We discuss their stories, but more important, what are their lessons learned? And how do those apply not only to flying, but to our everyday lives? Our purpose for doing this is to increase critical thinking skills, both in the air and on the ground. And some of these stories you're going to hear first on the Lessons from the Cockpit show, particularly today. Financial support for the Lessons from the Cockpit show comes solely from Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar at wallpilot.com. Go take a look at our ready to print. There's about 116 images there, printed on vinyl, 4 foot, 6 foot, and 8 feet that you can peel off and stick to any flat surface. But a lot of people just frame them the way that they are. These are really detailed images of World War II airplanes all the way up to F-22s. Today, folks, I'm really excited about this episode because this is the 5th part in our series on Operation Anaconda and specifically the Battle of Roberts Ridge. And today we're going to talk to Chief Warrant Officer Al Mack, who was flying Razor 3, the helo that Roberts fell off of. So grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit show with Chief Warrant Officer Al Mack. Good morning, Al Mack. Welcome to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. It's great to have you here.
Good morning.
We are so thankful to have you on, and particularly as part of this series that we're doing on Operation Anaconda and the Battle of Roberts Ridge. First question I'm going to ask you is, tell our audience a little bit about your background, where you started in the Army and what you did.
Okay. Well, first of all, I graduated high school in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the coast. I was going to go off to college. I realized I was not going to be a good student. I just wasn't going to do it. So instead, I joined the Army as an enlisted helicopter mechanic. Funny as I went in and said, hey, I want to fly helicopters. And the guy said, kid, it doesn't work that way. Sure, you can come in, high school to flight school, but it's much easier if you just join in aviation, get kind of used to it, and then put in for it. And, it was true, actually. So I did 9 years enlisted and kind of moved around, Korea, Germany, Texas, that kind of thing. I was going to get out of the Army and I put in for flight school at the same time, that I was making that decision. And I figured if I get picked up, then I will stay in. And if I don't, I'll get out. I'll be an aircraft mechanic for, Sikorsky or Augusta or Boeing or something. So, I got picked up. I went to flight school, I guess it was 1989 at Fort Rucker, Alabama. Lucky for me, I was top 2 people in my class. We argue about who actually had the highest grade point average. It was, by a point or whatever. But the cool thing about it is they took the top 2 people and they put them in Chinooks. So back in the late 80s, 90s, Chinooks were a very senior career field, right? You had to earn getting a Chinook transition. What happened was all these guys from the Vietnam era all retired at once, and they were short pilots. I mean, you see it nowadays, right? Same kind of thing happens.
Sure do.
They say, all right, fine, we're going to put a couple of W1s in the transition, which was completely unheard of. It was all W3s, 4s, captains and majors that were all senior. All they had to go on was grade point average. And so they just grabbed us, and I think it was a good choice. But I graduated from the Chinook transition in flight school, and Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait like a couple of weeks later. And so they hurried up my RL progression, my training in the cockpit there. We went to Saudi Arabia.
Oh my gosh, Al.
And that was Desert Shield, and then obviously the Desert Storm.
I was flying tankers at Jeddah during Desert Storm.
All right.
And my first base of assignment, Al, Pease Air Force Base when I was flying tankers.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the just so you know, the approach path, for landing was right over my house. And we didn't have remote control for the TVs as the jets would come in before they had the engine upgrade. Yeah. It was loud. And they'd have to get up and cut the TV. So I
remember two ships leaving within a half hour in the middle of the night, Al. The first one went off, and I was living in the Cedars, the White Cedar Boulevard, and all the car alarms went off.
Oh, yeah.
At 1:30 in the morning. And I said to myself, I rolled over, I said, don't go to sleep yet. And a half hour later at 2 a.m., another set of water wagons went over the top and set the alarms off again. But what a beautiful place to live. Oh my gosh, we loved living up there. So
it was good. I mean, my mother still lives up there, and now I live in New York, just above the city by West Point.
So you get to get up there and see her every once in a while. It's not that far of a drive. That's good. Yeah. That's great. So you end up flying Chinooks during Desert Storm, and I mean, your career goes way back. Holy smokes.
Yeah. So it was funny. I was digging through some photographs the other day in the attic, and I found some pictures of the Brandenburg Gate from the East Berlin side. So I'd gone to Checkpoint Charlie and the whole deal. So I was there before the wall came down. I was in flight school actually when the wall came down.
Amazing stuff. So you fly the Chinook for a while, and then obviously you get into the Night Stalkers. Talk to everybody about how that happens, how that works.
Well, first of all, when I was in flight school, I started in Hueys, right? And I always wanted to do air assault kind of stuff, and that's what I always saw. When I grew up, the Vietnam War was going on. It was always Hueys doing their thing. When I got Chinooks, I was actually not happy. Youth is wasted on the young, right? Yeah, I was not happy at all because it was all they do is fly around carrying cargo, right? Is what I thought. What I found is that wasn't the case. Obviously my first assignment there in Savannah, Georgia was for Desert Shield. Then I went to Korea for a year. And then I was lucky enough to go to Fort Rucker, Alabama and teach. The problem with teaching is I was a young W-2, Chief Warrant Officer 2, and I was not ready for an admin assignment. I still wanted to do stuff out and about in the world. One of the guys that I went to the instructor pilot course with was in the 160th, and he took a liking to me and gave me a packet, an application, which was like an inch thick, personal history and questions and all that. I just slowly filled it out a couple of blocks at a time, and when there were no more blocks left, I just mailed it in. And I really didn't think I would make it, because I knew some guys that I considered much better than me. They didn't get in for whatever reason, but no one ever tells you why they didn't really get in. It could be finances, it could be personality, who knows, right? I get a phone call from the battalion commander at the 160th, 2nd Battalion. He says, hey, we'd like you to come up and assess, and we're hearing good things about you, kind of thing. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went up there and assessed. It's a grueling process, 5 days. You start out with a physical fitness test, standard Army PT test. They don't count out loud, so you don't know how many push-ups or sit-ups they're counting. So it just adds a little stress. And they're always walking around with a clipboard, and just writing stuff. Wondering what are they writing? Did I not try hard enough or whatever? And then they take you right to the pool, and they throw you in the pool dressed in your flight gear, and you have to swim underwater, tread water for 15 minutes with just your feet, and then 15 minutes with just your hands, and then 15 minutes of regular. So you're in there for like 45 minutes, and then you swim down and back, and then you got to swim underwater, but they won't tell you how far you got to go, right? I swim down, I go as far as I can, start blacking out, and I was like, so I come up to the top, and I get out, and the recruiter comes up to me and he says, Mr. Mack, did you get to go twice? I was like, did I get to go twice? No. And he's like, well, get back in line. So I'm like, oh man, I must not have gone far enough, right? Turns out I did. That's just a sort of a tool to get you to quit,
they're messing with your head.
Yeah. And so I jumped in and I said, I'll just have to go until I black out. Swam down there and I actually got to the end. I didn't black out. So I went further than I thought I could. But then they send you down, you take a general aviation knowledge test, a threat systems test, 2 different psychological tests. One was like, 600 questions. The other was 250 or something like that. It's a long day. And then you go sit with a shrink and he analyzes your answers to these things. And then the next day they give you a flight eval, oral academic review first, and then they take you out to an aircraft and they have you fly it around, contact maneuvers like you would, take off, landing, hover, slopes, that kind of stuff. And then they give you your mission that you have the next night to fly. And it's all degraded navigation, right? So it's clock and compass. They always make sure they get the darkest night, they schedule this for. And nobody ever passes. Later on, as I became an instructor in the 160th, there's easy ways to make guys not pass.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I mean, everything is a little subjective, and all you got to do is make a couple of comments and they realize they didn't pass. So even the biggest egos get broken. And then you finish up with like in front of a panel, like a job interview. You sit in the middle in your dress uniform, and you have the battalion commander that's going to get you, the regimental commander, the shrink, the pilot that flew with you, the recruiter, and the psychiatrist. And they just try to break you. I've seen guys cry in there. I've seen guys storm out. I'm done with this. And at the end, it's, welcome to the 160th. So then I left Fort Rucker for the 160th, like in September of 95. I was there 17 years.
Wow.
Yeah, because you can stay as a warrant officer, you can stay there as long as you want, which is one of the perks. You get my kids went through the same, school system, kept all their friends. You know how it is in the military. You're always moving away. Your friends are moving away.
Yeah, but in a unit like that, why would you want to leave?
You don't.
Why would you want to leave a unit like that doing the things that you're doing?
It was great. I loved it. I would have stayed longer. We'll get into that later. But, and then, I left there to do my last assignment in the Army. It was at West Point. I was the flight detachment commander, flying UH-72 Lakotas, flying the superintendent around, parachute team, Army games. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. It was a good way to go out.
Yeah, just flying. Yeah. Just let me fly. Greg talked about going to, I think it was called Green Platoon. That's the training that you have to go through. Talk a little bit about that, what you go through when you do that. Because Greg told me when he got his first evaluation, he did it in the Chinook, which he had never flown before, which I thought was really interesting. They said, you got 2 hours to go prepare to fly this helicopter you've never flown before. That's
during that assessment process. They don't do that anymore. If you're rated in a particular aircraft, they'll fly you in it. But if you're not, they'll put you in a MH6 Little Bird to do your navigation eval. And they will put you in the simulator. So that was actually one of my favorite things, was to take guys into the simulator and you show them the basics of the cockpit, and then you have them do things. Call them the monkey skills. I could teach a monkey to fly, right? So if the guy can do the right monkey skills, then he's got some natural talent. And then if he can remember the page flow, because it's a glass cockpit, he learns quickly. I would say to the shrink, he oohed and ahed at all the right places, right? Because there's stuff that you just look at, you'll be like, oh, you're not impressed by that, you probably don't belong here, because that just isn't your thing, and that wouldn't keep you out, but it certainly is an indicator that maybe you're here for the wrong reasons. Maybe you're trying to punch a ticket or something like that. Yeah, so guys would do that. They'd fly these airframes that they'd never flown before. But, a Chinook's very easy to fly. It's big. Still just a helicopter. You pull up on the left hand and you go up, or you speed up and you move your hand left to right or forward, and the aircraft goes in that direction, and it's all the same. How it happens is different. It's all what we call PFM and magic.
Yeah. Al, I used to work for Rockwell Collins, all right? Which makes your cockpit, the CAS cockpit. Yep. Okay. Yep. We took that technology to other airplanes and it worked famously. That cockpit is very easy to maintain. Yep. We had a great program with you guys. And I actually got to fly the MH-60 in the little container. I think it was called the Boss, the little like cargo container that you could take everywhere that had the the helicopter sim in the back. And I did actually pretty good until they asked me to hover. Okay. I couldn't hover, Al, worth crap. Explain why that's so hard.
When I went to flight school, I thought that, the steadier your hand was, the better helicopter you'd be, helicopter pilot. But it's not. Every movement affects every other axis, every movement. In a more modern aircraft, you have, heading hold and hover hold and all these things that can do it for you, but they don't always work. Just like your iPhone, how often does an app just not work? Yeah. You got to restart the phone, and it's the same with a helicopter. But funny story, before we had the Rockwell Collins cockpit, we had an IBM cockpit for the MH-47 Echo. Very similar, but it was made by IBM. And the tilt rotor, the V-22, the Air Force was just ramping up on that. And it had the same cockpit as the MH-47E for the IBM cockpit. And the displays were exactly the same. The hover symbology was the same, the attitude indicators, and even the transmission page looked very similar, except instead of the transmissions, you also had the nacelles. So we go in there. There's a lieutenant colonel, this guy is going to demonstrate this for us. And a friend of ours that used to fly helicopters hooked us up on this. And this guy didn't know who we were. just some friends, and so he shows one guy, and he's very basic, like, this is a airplane, this is when it goes into helicopter mode, and he was very condescending. The first guy does really well. He picks up to a hover, turns it around, sets it down. Next guy gets in, because we're all standing in there watching. You're learning from the other guy. The second guy gets in, and he gets some harder maneuvers to do, and he does well. So this colonel's getting a little perturbed, and we don't know why. And then I get in there, and he says, all right, fine. He says, I want you to take off, go to 4,000 feet, and then I'm going to give you a place to land, right? And it's, the display in the simulator is very realistic, right? He points at this point in the road, a bend in the road, I want you to land there, and it's going to be a brownout. Okay, so I start coming in, and he did something to make me, so my angle wouldn't be right. So I just dropped it, and it had a sink rate warning. The platform has a tendency to settle with power. It settles in its own rotor vortices. And the only thing you can do, there's really only two things you can do. One is either power out of it if you have sufficient power, or you have to auto-rotate and outrun your vortices, right? Mm-hmm. So I know that, but he doesn't know I know that, right? And so I just start dropping the sink rate, alarms going off, and he's like, you're going to crash it. He's mad because if you crash this thing, sometimes the actual computer would crash, so you didn't want to actually crash it. Like little minor things, I guess it was okay, but every once in a while it would be down for a week if somebody crashed it. So I come in and I do some kind of pedal turn at the bottom, and I drop it right onto the ground. And he goes, that's bull. And he slams the freeze button. He goes, who the hell are you guys? Nobody gets in here and flies like that. I was like, we're Chinook pilots with the 160th. And he goes, oh, okay. And that was it. He thought that somebody had kind of punked him a little bit, because what they were doing is they were taking C-130 pilot and putting them in, and they couldn't hover, right? And they didn't understand rotor vortices and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. We went, the Marines went the other direction. They started with 46 pilots and then worked their way up. You can fly a helicopter, flying an airplane is really not that hard.
Well, and that was the thing, is I could fly it really good. I can stay in formation and do all that kind of stuff, And I had one of our Rockwell guys who had flown with your unit and other units. I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. He goes, hey, you're doing pretty good. And we're flying through the mountains of Afghanistan. All right. We're getting up in altitude. It's getting a little mushier and a little mushier as we're going up, But man, when he said hover over those numbers, Mark, I flunked big time. It was humbling, to say the least, for a jet wing guy to try and do that. So, hey, and you mentioned just a few minutes ago, hover vortexes and stuff like that. And I want to ask you, why the helicopter that came into Abbottabad, the stealth helicopter, crashed when it went over that wall. Would you explain that real quick? Because that was your doing that. And I know a lot of people don't understand why that helicopter crashed and the physics of what was happening.
So I wasn't on the mission, first of all, but I do know of it. I can tell you that having flown in that area of the world extensively, there was a performance planning calculation error, actually. Mm-hmm. So, you don't always know what the temperature is going to be. You know what the altitude is, right? From AFIF and maps and such. But you don't always know what the temperature is going to be. They kind of wished away about 15 degrees of Celsius. They used a standard lapse rate of 2 degrees per thousand feet. The aircraft just did not have the performance. The engines couldn't provide enough lift on those things at that altitude. And then when they were over the wall, that interrupted some of the rotor vortices as well, and they needed more power. And once again, it just wasn't there because they just they wanted to be on the mission so bad. They just kind of, we'll be all right. Standard lapse rate, but in that part of the world, you have to use a temperature delta, and you put that in the flight planning software so that instead of like 8,000 feet at about that, I think. And so maybe it was supposed to be by a standard lapse rate 20 degrees Celsius, but it was really 40 degrees Celsius. That kind of stuff happens. And if you don't leave yourself an out, like in our case, they didn't have an out really. They had to be where they had to be. And they did a good job of putting it down. It's math, simple math.
Yeah. So they actually put it down. It sounded like on the edge of the wall, because I know part of the helicopter went one way, part of the helicopter went the other way, correct?
Yeah. So they were supposed to fast rope into the compound, and they, if this is the wall, they're supposed to be like right here, and they got about this far. Yes. And then it started to settle, and then they tried to head it in, and it just hit.
Okay.
That's not much you can do. Actually, I was just at the Freedom Tower the other day on Ground Zero. We did a Night Stalker Foundation fundraiser. And part of that was a tour of the museum. They put a little video together and they actually talked about this. And they showed, from the sort of a documentary, and it was from the guys that were flying the Blackhawks, from the SEALs and the 47 pilots. That mission was always supposed to be just Chinooks, because of the altitude and the distances.
I didn't know that.
But they were concerned of, what if we get heard? So we get these, super secret stealthy helicopters that can get in there, and the Chinooks will come in later. They'll come about 15 minutes behind, so by then the operation will be basically done. And it turns out that the Chinooks had to go in and pull everybody out anyway.
Yeah.
Because they had to get out of there. So they had, so they had a quick reaction force of like 20 something SEALs. Plus they took the SEALs from the crash helicopter. Plus they took, bin Laden. And then they, the thing is, a lot of people think, big loud helicopter, you can't sneak around, but there are techniques and there's terrain and there's equipment. Little black boxes that do some really cool things.
Yeah.
Help you
because your Chinook has a very distinct sound when it's flying around. Okay. Yeah. So I live close to airport number 2 here in Salt Lake City. And you guys come in here a lot and practice up in the mountains over here by the house.
Yeah. Right.
And I remember one day coming out, because I could hear the blades coming. I could hear the engine coming, and I knew right away what it was. And as I came out onto my patio, it was literally going over the top of the house, probably at 300-400 feet. And I could tell it was one of your Night Stalkers, because obviously I had the refueling boom. But the reason I knew for sure was because there was 2 guys strapped on the ramp with their feet over the edge, just sitting there watching the world go by. And I go, those are Night Stalkers.
That is a great place to sit, I got to tell you.
Is it really?
Most of our flying's at night. One of the things we didn't talk about is I have about 7,000 hours of flight time with Chinooks, a little over 4, maybe even close to 5,000 hours of night vision time. Funny, I was talking to some guys from Fort Rucker one time, some friends of mine, and they said, so Al, how much total time do you have? And I said, or MVG time do you have? And I said, about 4,500. And they're like, no, not total time, goggle time. It's like, no, that's my goggle time. I've got about 7,000. They're like, oh, wow, that's a lot. I say, well, we are Night Stalkers.
Yeah. Well, I would expect you were in the unit, you said, for 17 years. 3/4 of your flights are probably at night, unless you're training during the day. Okay.
Yeah, that's true. And the flights are very long. You got five hours of gas, air refueling capability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back before the war, we used to do a lot more air, and then the Air Force got rid of some of the Papa models, which reduced the tanker fleet a little bit and a little tougher.
Yes.
We used to entice, we made friends. There's a KC-130 unit, KC-135 unit up in Waukesha, Wisconsin, right? And we would go up there and do flights over the lake and through Chicago and stuff, and do some of their annual life support stuff. Put them in the water, we'd hoist them out,
yes.
Stuff. And then what they were so cool about it, they were like, hey, you know how you have trouble getting tankers? Well, the C-130s have trouble getting tankers. We'll go anywhere and tank them if they'll tank you. That'll be the prerequisite. It's like, hey, we'll come, refuel you guys, but you got to refuel the 160th guys. So that was a pretty cool thing.
So Al, we did the same thing. I was stationed in Okinawa, and of course the 353rd's there. All right.
Yeah.
And we made a deal with them when they needed to go do their thing. We would go with them. And so we got to see some pretty cool exercises in some pretty cool places. Okay. Phuket, Thailand was our favorite by far. Okay. Which is a lot of fun to go, but we would refuel the MC-130 at 3,000 feet. And of course, the gas we put into them, they obviously put into you. So it was a great training for us to be down at 3,000 feet refueling the MC. And then they say, okay, see you. We got a ARCT with the helos off the coast of the Philippines somewhere, and off they would go. That was great training for us. And that contract that we made, similar to what you're talking about, was a great deal for us. Great deal.
Yeah, we really got a great benefit out of that. And then, of course, the war happened, and then it all kind of fell apart because we were never back in the States.
Yeah. So, Al, where were you on 9/11?
I was at 9/11. So I was at Fort Beauregard, Louisiana, which is down in the Fort Polk area. We were doing a JRTC, Joint Readiness Training Center rotation with some 5th Group guys. And the night before, I was actually out doing a Merops infill, which is the Zodiac boats. We'd fly down into the riverbed, and they kick the boats out. And there were some SEALs waiting for them. They link up and they go upriver and do their little thing. What was really neat about that night, it was a nasty weather night, and we had aircraft survivability equipment simulators put around, right? That we didn't know where they were. Our biggest threat was Rollins and SA-8s was the biggest threats to our stuff. SA-6, they'd always say, they're not going to shoot that at a helicopter. Of course, they shot at a 53 with that in Kosovo.
Yes.
So yes, they will shoot at you.
Yes. I remember that day well.
So we're flying around, and we get back, and we're in bed late that night. And the next morning, I got up, hear some guys in the hallway. It's one of those old, built in the 70s, cinder block, typical National Guard thing, the tile floors. And so I get up, and I'm like, hey guys, quiet. There's guys that just got to bed. And they're like, oh, you got to turn your TV on. So I turn on the TV. The first tower had been hit. It's like, this eerie airplane-shaped hole in the side. Like, oh my God, that's not good. It's like somebody's in trouble, and then all of a sudden the damn thing, the second one comes in. It's like, oh, we're under attack. That's no accident. So we ended up, the battalion commander and I drove back to Fort Campbell. It was like an 11-hour drive because they, grounded everything in the sky. And then the next day we received an intel brief about Afghanistan. Off we went to Tampa, Florida to plan retribution.
So the very next day, you guys were already looking at Afghanistan, weren't you?
Yeah.
By what you're telling me. Okay. So you guys knew the day after that you'd be deploying soon, wouldn't you?
Yeah, because they had just assassinated Massoud, right? It was the leader of the National Northern Alliance. In order to keep him from helping us do what we did. We just did it with Fahim and Dostum and a couple others, minus that leadership. It was tough.
Oh, I'll bet.
Tough to keep them all together.
You do all the planning, Al. Obviously, you deploy fairly quickly, don't you? Because this is September, and by October, we're dropping bombs.
Right. So we were, I don't remember off the top of my head if I got to Uzbekistan in late September or early October, because there was some time that we did personnel recovery was the initial mission. If the bomber crews or the fighter support, somebody had gone down, we would go rescue them with Air Force PJs. Mm-hmm. And so we did that for a while. And then we didn't know anything about the UW campaign, unconventional warfare, right? No one had told us. It was very compartmentalized because they still didn't know really what they were going to do. And they came in and they talked to me and Andy, the other flight lead, and they say, hey, we're going to take SF teams into these locations. And it was in these mountains that you had to get across the Hindu Kush, was 20,000 feet or so in many of the cases. They said, we can't carry what you want us to carry. So we had to split up the teams, 12-man team, divide them in half. And then, we had to air refuel in and out, which was really against our SOPs. We always were 3 deep in fuel contingencies. And in this case, it was nothing but relying on the tanker. At the altitudes we were going to be at, right? So we were going to be air refueling at 10,000 feet. In Army parlance, we always kind of felt that anything above 6,000 feet was too high. All of the incidents that we had in the regiment were all above 6,000 feet. You look back on it, it was nothing but technique. The way they used to do air refueling. And so we get to Uzbekistan and we realize as we look at the mountains, we're going to have to AR at 12, 13, 14,000 feet. And it's like, I don't know if we can do that. I don't think the tanker can slow down enough. We're doing it at 110.
Because you guys are way up there. 12,000 feet for you guys is way up there.
Right. And you think about the tanker, right? You're watching him kind of hanging on his prop, flaps are all down, and he's dirty. So we would go. So I went out before the very first mission. I met a tanker about 20 miles north of K2. Kashi-Kanabad, and I just started at 3,000 feet and went up 1,000 feet, and we just kept going up and up and up until we hit 12,000 feet, and then we didn't have any problems at all. And it was like, okay, we're good. You just got to do it slow, slow and methodical. You don't have none of that,
yeah.
I did there. And the rate of closure just has to be 2 to 5 knots instead of 5 to 10. It worked out. Sure enough, we had every night. Air refueling. There was no gas in Afghanistan back in those days.
Al, I find it fascinating that you're actually going out and exploring things that you have to do for your mission sets. And you're having to do, which is a great lesson learned, not only for flying, but also for our daily lives, doing this mission rehearsal to find out what can we do, to explore what can we do. And in the many cases, even in my big tanker you see here above my head, we had to do these kinds of mission rehearsals to figure out, well, we've never done this before. We've never been this deep into enemy territory at 3,000 feet, refueling the MC-130. What's that going to be like? I find that mission rehearsal piece very fascinating, that you're talking about trying to explore what are our capabilities here, because none of us had been to Afghanistan. And then a good example of that would be, my very first mission was with the SF team ODA 595, which they made the movie Horse Soldiers about with Chris Hemsworth. Also a book called 12 Strong. Anyway, we put these guys on scales, aircraft scales, right? We said, okay, look, here's what you can weigh. And they were not happy because in the peacetime training, we always did it, Fort Bragg or Florida, even out west in Colorado, typically we could carry everything in more, so the bump plan, if somebody broke, would be to just go get on the other aircraft. In this case, the other aircraft might not even have enough power to do what they had to do anyway. We would make them get on the aircraft, a 463L pallet on top of 4 aircraft scales. Say, nope, you got to get rid of 100 pounds. I don't want to get rid of 100 pounds. That's like this thing of ammo. Well, get rid of it because you're not going without it. Sure enough, they got down to the weight. And then we ended up, doing resupply missions and such to bring stuff in. And they had MC-130 combat talons doing drops to them and such. We had to be the correct weight because of the multi-mode radar, the MMR. So that's a terrain following radar. You can fly at 100, 300, or 500 foot set clearance in the mountains when you can't see out the window. It's all performance based. It was a very sophisticated radar for its time. It was actually the same radar I think it was used on the F-16 Lantern birds, but it could generate climb and descent commands. But you had to have the correct weight in there. So if the aircraft wasn't right, then the geometry was off, and you could smash into a mountain, or not have enough power when it thinks you do. That's interesting, Al. I didn't know that. Is that contained in that pod that's on like the left side of the airplane, right outside your window? Looking at the MH-47, I saw this pod next to outside the window there with the dome on it. And I go, what is this? And it's
so it doubles as, it does ground mapping radar, which really isn't all that easy to use. I have a son that flies F-18s in the Navy. He's a Wizzo. He would have to navigate using ground mapping radar. It's like looking at an ultrasound of a baby. It's like, I think that's a nose, But and there he would have to fly up in the Tennessee mountains up near Knoxville from Florida, using that. It's kind of interesting because I knew how to use that. I was like, that's how this works.
Yeah.
But,
so is your son an East Coast guy? Is your son an East Coast guy or a West Coast guy?
He started East Coast. He was at Oceana.
Yeah.
And then he did a deployment when he came back. That was on the Bush, I believe. And he ended up in Lemoore, California, up near Fresno. And he's just now on his way to Portugal for his joint assignment.
Oh, excellent. What's he going to do there? He's going to work in the embassy or something?
He's going to be some kind of liaison, some sort of a NATO guy.
Oh, man, he's going to love it over there.
That's what we're being told. It's quite frankly, it's easier for me to get there from New York than it is to get to Los Angeles and up to Fresno.
Up to Lemoore, up to Lemoore to see him. The Super Hornet that he flies is really a capable airplane. It's really an amazing
it's
airplane.
Neat.
So now you're there like 6 months prior to Anaconda.
Right.
Talk to us about.
No, I was going to say it's close to 7 months. Yeah.
Almost 7 months. Okay. So now we're at the KAOC in February. The colonel that's in the battlefield coordination detachment from the Army says, something's happening. It's big Army and it's named after a snake. And that's all he knew. That's all he could tell us. Tell our audience how you found out Anaconda's coming and then what happens after that.
All right. So Anaconda, we had no part in Anaconda in the initial planning phase. 101st, 82nd, things like that. Big air assault into the see, Objective Remington is the, like in Gardez area, I can't remember the name of the valley off the top of my head.
Chico.
Chico, yep.
Yeah,
there you go.
Chico.
And what's interesting about it is we were going to leave. The 160th B Company 2-160 SOAR was leaving, and we were going to be replaced by our sister unit, Alpha Company. So it was a RIP, relief from place. But they were delayed in coming over for some reason. And they said, all right, hey, look, they get this thing called Anaconda. We don't really have a part to play in it, but we might, so you guys can't leave until that's done. Okay, whatever, right? Turned out we were going to do is put all the special forces teams into the mountains overlooking all of the key points of egress and ingress. So that was all, the Germans, the French, the Norwegians, the American SF, English.
Yeah, Aussies, everybody.
Everybody, right? And that was our part in it. Now, we had my position was called flight lead, right? So my job was to lead flights of a mission. So I'm a primary planner, briefer, and the lead navigator, the whole spiel, right? So there's me and a couple of other flight leads. One guy, we'll call him Andy, is putting in all the coalition forces. Back then, the imagery that the users had was 1993 CIB, right? 10 meter. Yeah. So it was like, if you looked at Google Maps through a bottle cap, not a bottle cap, but the bottom of a bottle, that's kind of how clear it was. So they were looking at, topographic maps, trying to find contour intervals that were, wide enough to potentially be flat. But you don't know if there's trees or whatever there. So they have to do what they call a pace count, which is primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency landing zones. So each team has to pick, 4 potential landing zones. And if you get to one and it's no good, you go to the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And they generally get progressively worse. They wanted to go to the good one, and it's
Obviously.
No good, so you go to the next best one.
Yeah.
So that had a factor later on. And so that was his job. And then there was one guy, Chuck. His job was quick reaction force, and that's who Greg was flying with. And I was the HVT flight lead. So I was the high value target guy. The reason we were even sticking around and helping with this is the CIA was telling us that bin Laden and or Zawahiri were present in the Shaikaut.
Yeah.
So if he were to pop up, I was the guy that was supposed to go after him. Well, as some time went by, and so the weather's going to be bad. So they push it like 2 weeks to the right. In the meantime, all the NGOs are getting notified. So the non-governmental organizations, UNICEF, Red Cross, UN, all that kind of stuff, they're being told, hey, whatever you do, don't be here. And of course, the enemy gets to hear all that, right? So the enemy now has 2 weeks to prepare that they didn't originally have. And they were very well prepared. Places that, these caves and these fighting positions that were used in the 80s. And the mission happens 2 weeks later. It's obvious that bin Laden and Zawahiri are not there. So we start looking for other things to do. Like, Al, why don't you go down, put some SEALs in to do an observation post because, the 101st is getting their ass handed to them, right? Because the enemy was prepared for them.
Yep.
So we're going to go to the top of Takur Ghar. It's the biggest piece of terrain in the valley that has visual line of sight
across the
everywhere.
entire valley.
Right. So, and there's a saying, key terrain is key terrain.
Yeah.
Right.
Decisive point.
Right. And the enemy was already there. We didn't know it.
Yeah.
And so when I fly down to Gardez, I pick up my SEAL team. We're going to fly 2 aircraft to put 2 different teams in 2 locations, right? I'm actually supposed to go to the base of Takur Ghar with my guys. Just to the northwest, is another team's going to go in just north of Ginger. And so we fly down together and we hit a release point and we separate. My wingman, Razor 04, goes to the right. I go to the left. And then we get called off. There's a B-52 strike coming in. So we don't actually land. We go back to Gardez. The B-52 strike happens. We go back again, except now we get called off again because the 101st Air Assault had been adjusted for the B-52 strike. Mm-hmm. Now they're coming in. So I go back to Gardez again. Now, keep in mind, there's no gas, no fuel in that area unless I have air refueling, and everybody's occupied. I shut the aircraft down to wait, so I'm not burning gas. And the problem is the aircraft I was flying had a very bad generator swap. When you go from the auxiliary power unit to the main engines and the main generators, there's a relay. And these relays back then were bad. And some of the black boxes didn't like swapping
that
generators.
switch.
So we had these little computers that ran the engines. They're called FADAC, like full authority digital something control. I can't remember. So it comes time to start up again, and we get a fault code on the thing, a little LED display. And I look it up in the checklist, and it's like, oh, it's flyable. It's called a soft fault. It's flyable. And I continue with the process, except what that fault was, it turns out, is a reversionary stepper motor hard fault, which means that if you select, there's a little switch on the overhead for primary and alternate. If you go to the alternate mode of control, it says the engine will high side, right? But that wasn't in any of our documentation. We found this out months later. After the fact, right? So they adjusted that checklist to now tell you not just that it's you can fly or not, but what will happen if you do. And so anyway, these like 12-foot flames come out of the back of the engine, and everything goes red in the cockpit. The displays, and it's like I am not taking this. With the SEALs, right?
So this is the engine problem everybody reads about.
And this is also where, one of the things about Anaconda was there was so much confusion because the unity of command wasn't there, right? Everybody was on different radio nets and such. And the thing is this, so Razor 1 and 2 were the QRF birds, right? So like Razor 5, 6, and 7 had been doing infills, and they needed Chuck's birds to continue because they had all this problem getting guys in. He had just gone down with Razor 5, 6, and 7 and was headed back to Bagram. And he gets to Bagram as I get shot down. Or no, I take that back. So he's getting there, and I need a replacement. So he's going to now fly his aircraft back to me, give me his aircraft. I will do my mission with his helicopters, and a maintenance pilot will come along and recover my aircraft, and they'll fly them back to Bagram. So that's what happens. And the problem with that is it takes 45 minutes to get from Bagram back, right?
So the
SEALs are realizing that they're going to have to go from the base of the hill to the top, and it's going to get daylight before they can do that. So they asked me if they can go to the top of the mountain. And I said, well, I have not seen any imagery of the top of the mountain. And that wasn't that I was worried about threat, because I knew I'd have an AC-130 overhead, and I figured he'd do a sensor sweep, and that would be good anyway. But I didn't know if there was a place to land based on the experiences Razor 1, 2, 5, 6, and 7 had. They said, no, I've seen imagery. It's okay, right? Okay. They bring the aircraft down. We do a swap, and it's a front-end swap only. So just the pilots, the crew chiefs stayed with the aircraft. And I'm with a crew I've actually never flown with, ever. Never even talked to these guys. They're from our sister company that was just starting to filter in. And so we go up there, and the other thing that happened a couple of days prior, actually it was the day prior, is there was a friendly fire incident, fratricide, of an SF team leading the main Afghan assault force. And the AC-130s, for some reason, mistook them for enemy, and they lit them up with the 40 millimeter and really messed them up.
I know what happened there. Nail, I believe it was callsign Nail 31. Their navigation system had precessed about 1.5 miles. So when they laid down fire, not only did they look at the wrong place, but I think the navigation systems were off too. So they weren't firing at what they thought they were firing at too.
Right.
This is where Harriman gets hit, correct?
Yes. And what that did is that changed the rules of engagement for everybody, which plays into the whole next day. So
we were supposed to have 55 minutes of nothing but B-52s and fighters bombing the crap out of that place.
Right.
I mean, massive firepower putting down here, because all the B-52s were carrying 2,000-pound bombs. I mean, big bombs that have like a 3,000-foot blast pattern. And when Harriman got hit, there was a knock it off call that went everywhere, and everybody went, oh, we got to knock it off. And I think we dropped like 6 or 8 bombs out of the 55 minutes we were supposed to drop, and that was it. That's what you're talking about. That stopped all that.
Yeah. Yep. And so when we've got to go to the top of the mountain as opposed to the base. So we take off again, flight of 2, we separate the release point, go to the top of the hill, and the AC-130 is looking, and this may be why they cleared the LZ, because if it was the same aircraft, if that nav system had some errors in it, they may have been looking off
at the wrong
LZ,
place.
because there's no way they shouldn't have seen the heavy machine gun, the footprints on the snow, a donkey, guys walking around. but they didn't see it. So they might not have even been looking at the right spot, which could explain something. So we get up there and we land unopposed. I think we really surprised, the enemy. We kind of landed inside their perimeter.
Which seat are you sitting in the front?
I'm in the left seat.
So you have command of the helicopter.
Right.
With the SEAL Team MAKO 30, Britt Slabinski, John Chapman, all those guys in the back. Okay.
And the other thing back in those days, one of the problems is that the aircraft was designed to penetrate Soviet airspace, the Soviet Union, right? We had our helmets plugged into a Tempest modded ICS, right? So there's ways to just to oversimplify it. There's equipment that can pick up you talking inside the aircraft through your intercrew communication system. I don't remember how. So that's what this was designed for. And the problem is the SEALs, the Delta Force guys, the Rangers, all of their squad equipment didn't need that, right? Because it's a powered system. It's not just a plug in. So what they would have to do is the team leader would listen on a headset.
Yes.
So when he got off, he would take off his headset. Now he can no longer talk to me. And then he puts his helmet on and he can talk to his team, right? So there's a gap. And so we land and he's take the headset off with his helmet. And I go, hey, get the team leader back on a headset. There's a donkey and a machine gun right there, right? And he needs to know that because that Dishka is 14.5 millimeter and that's going to tear those guys up if they. And
it's a big gun.
Right. Puts the thing, what's up? And I point out, hey, you got this. And he's like, okay. And he's thinking for a second and he goes, okay, we're taking the LZ. And he takes his headset back off, puts his helmet back on. And as they go to move, we get hit by the RPG from our left. And what's happening there is he's got his headset off. The left door gunner, who had it been my original crew, would have shot the guy, right? Because there's hostile act, hostile intent. We were still a different weapons control status. We'd been there for 7 months, and my guys, this crew I was with, had only been there about a week. They strictly followed the rules of engagement. Where let's just say I would be a little more liberal application of it. The guy popped up, and the gunner says, "There's a guy at my 10 o'clock, and he just disappeared." And it's like, okay, well, if he, I'm thinking to myself, he should have shot him, but everybody's still thinking about the fratricide. And he said something like, "How do we know they're not, friendlies?" And I said, if they're friendly, they're not going to stick their head back up while we're sitting here. I said, you see him again, you kill him. And he's like, yes, sir. And the guy popped up again, but he was now about 11 o'clock. The guy didn't quite see him. First thing I saw was the lava lamp with sparks flying out of the back of it, the RPG. Yeah. Just like in the movie Black Hawk Down, it really looks like that. And it couldn't have hit a better place for me. I mean, it could have missed, which would have been better, but if it had been another foot to the aft, it would have hit the main fuel tank and we would have blown up. If he had been another foot to the forward, he'd have hit the flight control closet, which is where all of the bell cranks and push-pull tubes and actuators are that actually allow you to fly the aircraft. Or he could have hit the cockpit and
where you were at
that point. So it went right through the electrical compartment. It took out 3 geographically separated wire bundles, right? So the Chinook has 3 generators, 2 main and 1 APU. And they're, the ones on the left side are got to be 3 feet apart. And then there's one on the other side of the aircraft. It took out all 3 of those because it came through an ammo can, for the miniguns. And it just threw stuff everywhere, big explosion. And luckily the doors were all open and, for the guns. So there was no overpressure like it would be if it went through armor. It kind of stunned everybody, put a big fire in the cockpit. The guys had to put that out. And I took off. And for a minute there, I'm thinking, are the SEALs off the aircraft or are they on? Or half of them off or half on, right? Because we never talked about, because this was just a simple infill, and we got a little lazy, I think, a little overconfident. And, because I'd had a lot of stuff shot at me. I had 2 man pads fired at me. I had RPGs, heavy caliber machine, 23 millimeter, and it always missed. I say, miss by an inch, miss by a mile, it doesn't matter. A miss is a miss. Yeah. Right? Well, in this case, they hit us, and we ended up counting bullet holes in that thing when we recovered it. There was 65 bullet holes in it, plus the RPG holes. So
I've seen a picture of the aircraft when you got it down on the valley. Is that big hole just forward of the fuel tank? Is that what caused it?
Yeah.
And it looks like there's a red battery box behind it or something like that, if I remember right. Okay, so that's where it hits. I'll put in the show notes that picture so everybody can see what you're talking about, because there's a great article about how they went up and rescued the airplane and got it off the mountain called At a Great Height that has some really good pictures of it in there. Yeah,
the Mi-26, which actually hauled the woolly mammoth for the Discovery Channel. It's kind of
really?
yeah.
That's crazy.
But
okay, so you're hit, and you've got a gunner on that side who is somebody really you don't know, and he sees all this happening. Plus, you're getting shot at from the top of the mountain and everything. I think that's where we're at. Keep going.
Right. So we're getting hit from all sides, and the crew chief in the back, way back at the ramp, is still on the ICS, on the communication system. He says, "Fire in the cabin, go, go, go." And I'm not sure what that means. It should have been, F ready forward, ready, clear for flight, or something like that. But so I'm like, okay, I guess that means go, right? So I took off. The aircraft is still flyable. There's no electric working at all, other than what's on the battery bus, which would be the intercrew communications. So I've got 4 blank MFDs, multifunction displays. So the TVs are all just blank.
At 3:30 at night.
It's late. And so as I take off, you could hear the engine is now in its reversionary mode, right, which is the backup mode, and it's not nearly as good. So when you pull power, the little computers that control the engine power aren't as robust. They don't react as quickly. So you can hear the droop as the rotor RPM slows down. You can hear it go, whirr, and then it kind of catches back up. And then as we do that, we're also missing the AFCS, the automatic flight control system, right? The reason a Chinook is so easy to fly is because of these little black boxes that do that, PFM. And without it, the aircraft is very, very unstable, right? What was good for me is I used to practice that all the time. And I was probably one of the better, I was probably the best in the unit at flying like that. But the aircraft pitches kind of like this, right? When I pull power, there's a whole aerodynamics thing about that. But I think I lost an engine, right? And I have no indications, but I heard that droop and I thought, at this altitude, I cannot fly with one engine. I immediately nose it down to regain rotor RPM, and I'm diving down the mountain. And my intention is to crash at the bottom, essentially with an auto rotation, not really a crash, but end up at the bottom. The crew chiefs kind of get their act together. They were stunned by the blast, and they come up on the comms finally and go, "Hey, the engine's running. Both of them are running. Are you sure?" Like, yeah. Because if I pull in power at this altitude now, we will definitely fall out of the sky. So I squeeze in the power, we level off. And it's like, all right, we're good. Except now they tell me that we lost a guy, Navy SEAL, Roberts, which the battle's named after. Right? So he had fallen from about 12 feet onto the snow below, which was about hip deep snow. What we found out later on is that he took some damage, physical damage, to his femoral artery. They know that for a couple of years. I mean, obviously we got his body back, but his saw, his machine gun, was full of blood, right? And it was all gummed up, the mechanism with what would have had to be arterial spurt. And that's the only place that he got shot like that. So we think that he actually, not only did the ramp kind of fall down a little bit, and he had this big giant rucksack, and he already had momentum because he was moving out. Yeah. But if he got shot in the thigh as that was happening, he just essentially tumbled out onto the ground. Now, one of the crew chiefs grabbed him, like out of a movie. Had he been Sylvester Stallone, he could have held onto him by one hand and dragged him back in. But a 230-pound man with a 100-pound rucksack moving in that direction just yanked my gunner right out the back. Now, he had a harness on, so he only fell about 6 feet.
But he's dangling behind the helicopter.
He's dangling like a yo-yo, and I don't know that. So one of the crew chiefs that's in the back, the guy that had yelled at me to go, realizes what's going on, and he goes and he pulls him back in. And then as he pulls him back in, I start banking to the right, and we're taking fire from the hill still. And so we still had one machine gun, an M60, that's not electric, is at his position, and he's returning fire after just pulling this guy up. And then the controls freeze up because the hydraulic systems had taken rounds. So now he's with a little can opener, he's opening a can of hydraulic fluid, and there's a little fill module, looks like a little coffee can, and a little pump, and he puts a quart of hydraulic fluid in there, and the trolls come back. And now I'm like, all right, well, let's go get that guy, right? So I bank hard again to the right.
That's
level out,
amazing.
and the hydraulic fluid, it was a hole on the return side, because if it was on the pressure side, it would have just gone anyway.
Immediately.
So every time I made a movement, it squirted out fluid. So I'd last about 50 seconds per can. So then I realized when it locks up at that point, we're not going to make it, because I don't have any guns, but just that one M60 and it's out of bullets now. So I go, all right, guys, we're going to try to make it to MAKO 2-1's LZ, which was where my wingman, Razor 4, had put the other SEALs. So now we turn them back to the left. The big battle is raging below me. I can see the whole thing, the terrain feature called the Whale, and I can see friendly positions. And I'm trying to descend at a rate that if the hydraulics lock up again, that maybe we'll survive impact. So I had a 300 foot a minute rate of descent and doing about 70, 80 knots, which is all the aircraft would do without the longitudinal cyclic trims, which are these little boxes that kind of move the discs. So really, the aircraft was in a great position. My co-pilot starts reading off altitude and airspeed. I'm like, where are you seeing that? And he taps on the backup attitude indicator, which was like this little
it's like
and my vision had been so tunnel vision on what I was doing in my mind on flying the aircraft. I didn't even remember that thing existed. And he's over there sitting there like, hoping Al does a good job. And he's like, he starts doing his crew duties, and it really,
aviate, navigate, and communicate.
Absolutely. So we start getting toward the bottom. I see where I want to land. I'm not going to land where I wanted to be because I just couldn't bring the altitude down. Okay. And then you put like the last can of fluid in, it ran out about 30 or 40 feet off the ground. And I had been going for the top of this like very gentle knoll. As we cut down to the bottom, the aircraft started to drift laterally to the right. And I could not control that anymore. There's also a saying, never quit flying the aircraft, right? So I know I can't move the cyclic stick, but I jam my right pedal and the nose swings around one last time as we hit the ground. So we hit the ground straight on, and I had one more push on the power, and we just kind of settled at about a 20-degree cross slope and about 15 degrees nose high. And that was all without, it was a dust landing with no AFCS. So, and that was all stuff I had practiced as a younger pilot. And guys would always say, Al, come on, it's a pain in the ass doing that. I was like, never know.
But you have that intuitive expertise, Al, because you had done that. You had done that, and you intuitively knew, okay, this is what I need to recover the airplane, or at least get it down so everybody's alive. That's the amazing thing.
What it reminds me of, a good example of that, and by no means am I the guy I'm going to talk about, but Sullenberger, right?
Yes.
When he landed on the Hudson River, he used to practice that stuff in the simulator, and the guys would make fun of him, and he'd be like, "You never know, and you can't have that kind of engine failure, that altitude." And he had practiced it, and so when it came time to do it, and like I said, I'm no Sully, but it's the same premise. I just practiced things other guys didn't do, and it saved my life.
That's a great life lesson too, Al. I know a lot of my students, when I was an instructor, I put them through some things that, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And then have them later come back and go, oh, I had that very issue. And because you had done that, we were able to save a crew or an airplane or whatever.
Right. And think about it, the two things that we both said, so we both flew different airframes, different types of airframes, different military services. Yet we both know aviate, navigate, communicate is a priority of effort, and never quit flying the aircraft.
Yeah. So fly the jet, fly the plane, fly the helo. That's ingrained in you. Your priority number one, fly the aircraft.
For sure.
Okay. So now you're on the ground and everybody's alive, but there's the guys in the back still aren't on headset, are they?
No. So they know a guy fell out, but they think that we're at the base of the hill, right? We're really about 10 miles away. What is kind of interesting with this, so this is where me not knowing the crew is a big deal, right? Because normally I'd be like, Bob, Bill, come here, do this. Yeah. And I'm like, who are you? And they knew I didn't know them. They're like, hey, I'm Mike, I'm whatever. And it's like, okay. but it's dark and I'm still all amped up, and I could not remember their names all night. And they thought it was funny, and they would come back and go, "Hey, what's my name?" I was like, damn it, I don't know. And I wasn't ashamed to say, I don't know. I know what position. You were the left gun. You were the right gun. You were the ramp. I don't know your name. But I'm running around trying to make sure I got my GPS out, trying to get our position. The SEALs have already established a little bit of a perimeter. We had John Chapman, the CCT, is in contact with one of the AC-130s overhead. Plan was for my wingman and me is that, so we'd separate and then we would rejoin about, so many miles north of our objectives up near Gardez, and then we go home. But I also knew that we didn't have gas. If something happened, we didn't have fuel to hang around. So I said, here's the deal. You go up to the rendezvous point, you wait, you start your clock, 15 minutes. If the other guy doesn't show up, do a radio search and leave. I mean, because if the guy's just having a problem, maybe he can call on the radio. But, I couldn't. In his case, the AC-130 was on our fires net. He was able to say, hey, Razor 3's over here. So my wingman comes. So we're about on the ground, probably about 40 minutes total when it all said and done. So the plan initially is to take us all back to the top of the hill and pick up Roberts. But he's got too much gas for that to carry the SEAL team and my crew. So he's like, that's not going to work. We agree initially that I'm going to stay there with my crew, and the SEALs will go back and they'll come pick us up afterwards. Except the AC-130 says there's enemy troops headed your way. We've been cleared to engage, but we can't guarantee we'll get them. So the commander back at the, back at base says, no, you can't stay there. Go back to Gardez, right? The wingman, Razor 4, takes us all back to Gardez. They dump me out and my crew, and the SEALs, he takes the SEALs back in. Now, remember I said fuel is an issue, right? So he gets up there and he runs into the same problem with the AC-130. They won't shoot what's on top of the hill. They're like, no, there's a friendly up there. We cannot shoot up there. And he's like, but if you don't shoot, I'm probably going to get shot down. And they're like, all right, we'll shoot. And they don't, right? There's no pre-assault fires. There's no actions on, even though he's taking fire from the Dishka now. So his aircraft is Swiss cheese. I mean, and they're not returning fire because same reason, they're not sure exactly where Roberts is.
So that's Razor 4 that we see in the video.
Razor 4.
That's Razor 4 we see in the video that has Mako 30 going out of it in that famous video now of Chapman's Medal of Honor thing. Okay.
Right. They end up getting in there and he holds for about 5 minutes in case they've got him, he'll go back and get him. And that doesn't happen. And he has to come back to Gardez. He lands and there is no fuel indication in his aircraft, right? The tanks are empty. When he shuts down the APU, the auxiliary power unit flames out, which means that the left tank is empty and, the right tank had no indication. So it was out. And the thing about that is, so some of the confusion that comes later on is because back at Bagram, they think that aircraft is just out of gas. They don't realize it's been shot to pieces. So I get sent out there to check on it. Like, if we send you fuel, can we put it back in the fight? And so I go out there and the crew chiefs are looking at it. They got wire bundles in their hands, that have been shot through with that 14.5 millimeter. And I'm like, what do you think, guys? If we get gas, can we put this in the air? And they're like, you see this wire? You see this one? You know what they do? Neither do I. Right? Like, okay, so it's not flyable. In the meantime, they were back at Bagram putting an internal fuel tank into one of the Chinooks, and they were going to fly it down. I call up there on the phone and say, hey, that aircraft's not flyable. There's no need to put a tank in. So they pulled the tank back up because now they're going to use it for people. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of confusion, like people that would walk up. Which one is that? Oh, that's Razor 7. Why is he putting the fuel tank in? And why are you taking it out? Nobody knew because they all thought they were just coming to get me. That's what they know. Yeah. So the information flow is not, the continuity is bad, right? Welcome and by the way, there's communications jamming going on that we're doing, right? So there's what they would call comms fratricide. So we're jamming ourselves, trying to keep, the Taliban and Al Qaeda from using push-to-talk radios and such. So a lot of the problems that happened with Greg's aircraft, plus we were using a low-angle satellite for communication. So if you had, you banked too hard or you put a little hill in your way, your communication gets interrupted or doesn't get through at all, right? Which happened to them. So anyway, I actually had to write a thing. I could email it to you. I call it Razors for Dummies. It talks about the call signs and what they were doing and when. Razor 1 and 2, when I was going down in the original infill with Razor 3 and 4, we actually passed each other and kind of, flipped our searchlights on and off, waved. I go down, he's going back up. And
I didn't know
that's why
that.
everybody's like, well, how is Al's aircraft Razor 3, not Razor 1? It's because it wasn't Razor 1, it was Razor 3. It's just the way it was. But I can send you that. It's like a 2-page Word document.
Oh, please do. I'd love to see that. Because I teach this to the Air Force guys now.
Oh.
The Air Force ROTC actually has now the Roberts Ridge case study that all 400s are taught every year. Brigham Young University has me come down and teach it because I was running air refueling. So yeah, I'd love to see that. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll send you that when we get off.
Okay. But, so you're back at Gardez now, correct?
Yes. Yep. So I'm back at Gardez, and so Razor 1 and 2 come back with their original mission, the QRF, right, Quick Reaction Force. They aren't sure what's exactly going on or what their mission is. They've been told to launch because there's 45 minutes in route time. So they're like, we'll just tell you on the radio when you get down there. And that's the whole bit about the comms fratricide.
Yeah.
They weren't able to explain to them exactly what to do. So they come down and they fly over my helicopter, which was their original objective, and there's nobody there, right? I mean, it's obvious there's no one there. So now Razor 1 isn't sure what's going on, Chuck, right? And he's like, you know what? Razor 2, you go to FOB Gardez and set down on the ground and let me find out what's going on. I'll call you forward when I'm ready. So now there's just one aircraft over the thing that he has to worry about. He gets there, and then he gets told the coordinates to go to, which is where I got shot up. And that is not where they were supposed to go. A guy named Pete Blaber, who was the AFO commander, was
Great
on
book.
another radio net
Great book.
saying, tell him to go 800 meter offset. The P3 that was supposed to relay that information never relayed it. And I actually just heard that radio conversation a couple of months ago where Blaber is saying, do not let them go to that coordinate. They'll come out of the sky, immediately. They'll get shot down. And the P3 got shot at as the guy was about to. They were performing evasive maneuvers. They thought it was a SAM, could have been a 2S6 or something like that. But they did that. And of course, everybody's like, oh, hanging on. And by the time they do it, Chuck's already getting shot down. It's too late. That's kind of how that played out. And of course, you talked to Greg about that. But so I'm over at Gardez still. I'm in the cockpit of Razor 2, telling him what happened to me. And then he gets the word, hey, Razor 1's been shot down. He said, I got to go. So he gets the offset LZ coordinates, and he puts his team in. Those are the Rangers that work their way up the hill later on.
Uphill.
So daylight's there, and I'm at the FOB, and we're making what we call kick rucks. So we're taking the rucksacks from our aircraft, putting ammunition and water and some food in them. The ones that had ammo, which we figured they need the most, we put like big red ribbons on, so we could say, hey, go for it. You don't want to go get the MREs, under machine gun fire when you got bullets over here, kind of thing. So we did that, and then they never ended up doing that because they decided to do a rescue the next night, or that next cycle of darkness. Yeah, so we were at the FOB there, and then for us, there was an enemy convoy headed our way. They knew that through electronic intercepts, and all that's there at the FOB is my 2 air crews, Razor 3 and 4, an Air Force weatherman, a 3-letter agency guy of some sort. He never told me who exactly he worked for, but we had an engineer, an E4 from 10th Mountain, with our Afghan force, right? But so this FOB looked like the Alamo, and we took our machine guns that we had left, a lot of ammunition. We had a couple of anti-tank weapons on board, AT-4s. We all had rifles. We came up with this big plan, like something out of a movie. My guys will be up in the corners. We did range cards to figure out how far everything was. The AC-130 did come back and put some rounds down on the convoy, and they dispersed, ran away. So they never did attack us. But we were going to blow a hole in the back of the wall. Like the engineer rigged up these big charges on the back, and we had the vehicles facing the back because they figured they'd assault the main gates. And my job, as they blew the wall, is I was going to crawl into this big pit under a tarp that's where all the ammunition was. And I was going to pull this little ring, and that's to a satchel charge and a detonator. And then I go get out of there and I jump in the vehicle, and we drive as fast and as far as we could out the back of the building. Then we would hope that the ammo dump would blow up on these guys when they got in finally. Luckily, we didn't have to do that. I did get a phone call. They came and got me like, hey, Mr. Mack, come to the talk. And the colonel says, all right, you guys got to be outside, ready to go, 2000. I think that's what the time was.
Yeah.
So they do the rescue from the top of the hill. They come down to get us, and we had to go through a minefield in the dark to get to the landing zone, Gavin, DZ.
Oh, gee.
I got in the aircraft that had all the KIAs, right? So all of the friendly killed in action are on the aircraft, and unfortunately their bodies had been frozen or had rigor. They were not very neatly put in there. They did what they could to show some respect, but they were all over the place. So we're dragging our sensitive gear into the aircraft, and what I don't know is they're about to run out of gas as well. So the crew of that aircraft is yelling at me, "You got to move faster, move faster!" And my crew chief, my flight engineer, actually walks in and he stumbles on one of the bodies, and he falls face to face with one of his best friends, who was the crew chief that died on Razor 01. It freaked him out. He stood up and he snapped into the chair rail, and he wouldn't move forward. So now I've got even less room to work with, and he's not helping me because he's pretty upset. So I get this stuff on. They raise the ramp. I sit down on the floor, and I'm thigh to thigh with Neil Roberts. As we're riding back, he was still wearing his watch, and the vibration was like this, and you could see the luminescent dots of his watch. And I thought maybe he was alive. I was like, is he alive? What's going on here? And then my mind started playing tricks on me. But if he's dead, but he's moving, what's happening here? Oh, jeez. Yeah, so they were able to get back to the 101st and set up a FARP, Forward Arming and Refueling Point, which was just another Chinook in the middle of the desert. And these guys went in, and it was very dusty, and they did like 3 different approaches with go-arounds because they didn't do a good job of the approach. Eventually, they didn't have a choice. They landed hard, and I could tell it was an act of desperation because of how we landed. And then the engine flamed out, the left engine. So that was their urgency. I didn't know we were at a FARP. I just know we're on an aircraft in the middle of nowhere. We just landed, and the engine flamed out, and I'm with all the dead guys. 2-3 minutes later, nobody had moved, and I hear the APU start, which means gas was now in the left tank. And I was like, okay, we must be at a FARP, which I didn't know existed. They got us back to Bagram, and it was interesting because Bagram is a place that ever since the very beginning was dark, right? There was never any lighting at night, for OPSEC kind of stuff. And we would say, this is Bagram dark, Bagram dark. If you didn't have a light, that was bright enough, sometimes you'd lose balance walking because there was no visual reference. And we get to, they're unloading the dead guys, and we're at a well-lit airport. And everybody's asking me, where are we, sir? I'm like, I don't know. I think maybe we're in Kandahar, or not Kandahar, Kabul. Maybe we're in Kabul because I don't recognize any of this. And I had to walk up to somebody and say, hey, where are we? He goes, we're at Bagram. Well, I don't recognize this. I've never seen the lights on. We grabbed our stuff and we walked down this dirt road that later is named Disney Highway to the TOC, the camp. We just kind of walk in, and everybody's just looking at us weird, like, oh, wow, you guys made it. Very surreal. Yeah. Oh, and then what was terrible is the next morning, actually, they do a vehicle interdiction where they go out and they think they see bin Laden, and they send the helicopters out. They come back. They obviously didn't get him, but they come back, and the weatherman says there's going to be a blizzard tonight, and it's going to last like 4 or 5 days. The teams in the mountains have got to come out tonight, right? The commander comes to me. He's like, Al, I need you to fly tonight. We got 2 3rd Battalion aircraft that just came up from Kandahar. They just got in country. You got to go pull everybody out. So, all right, I'm sitting on my cot, cleaning my rifle, and I need a co-pilot. None of the other guys wanted to fly. They're like, I can't do it, And so I knew who would fly, and that was the guy that was the pilot in command of Razor 02. And I got him. We call him Ahmed. He looks Middle Eastern. And I was like, Ahmed, I need a co-pilot. What do you think? And he's like, let's do it, you know. And sure enough, we pull everybody out. But the last team I'm supposed to get is the Germans. They report that they're surrounded by armed men with RPGs, right? So they, task the AC-130 to be overhead. I hear about this and I go to the colonel that was the liaison. I said, hey, tell the Germans to mark their positions and kill anything within 200 meters of it. It's not that hard, right? And the guy's like, we can't do that. Once again, it's all part of that Harriman thing. And so I'm like, all right, fine. So I'll go anyway, right? So now we're going to go, except we're 5 minutes from landing to get them. And the AC-130 says he's got to go home. Yeah, I got to go home. It's going to be late when we get back to Masira.
Yep.
Masira. It's going to be late in Masira. You can't stay another 5 minutes. There's guys with RPG. This is the same situation I got shot down with.
I've seen this movie.
Yeah. Randy gets on the radio. I'm going flying there, Ahmed, and he says, you can't leave. He actually shamed him into staying. Luckily, we didn't get shot at, and we came home. And then a couple days later, we left. The relief in place happened, and we went back. I did write an after-action review that everything I put in there got done. Things like when I was on the ground after the crash, I had an M4 with a laser on it, an infrared laser. I had no way to wear my night vision goggles. So if I wore my flight helmet, which I would do in the cockpit, I can't hear anything because it's got ear cups. Yeah. And we always just say, well, take the ear cups out. Well, then your helmet's all floppy and you can't, it's useless anyway. I had them buy, initially it was Protex, the little hockey helmets that Delta Force guys wear. But what I had with my goggles at the time was this little handheld pack that you clipped onto on the goggles and you could hold them like binoculars, but now you can't use your rifle. So we ended up fixing that. I was also, by the way, the senior Chinook pilot in the regiment. So I had influence on a lot of this stuff. You remember I talked about the ICS cord, right?
Yes.
The team leader had to wear the headset.
Yes.
I had that moved. Like we went back to the old system because Tempest just wasn't a big deal. Then all of the team could talk to all of the aircraft at the same time. There was none of this taking helmets off and stuff. The other thing was, remember I said I had the backup attitude indicator? Well, what I needed was to know if the engines were running. I had them add a rotor RPM and two little lights, green, I think it was green and red. Green meant the engine was running at operating, and red, it was running at something less than flyable. And so you had that. And a friend of mine had a very similar situation than I did, except he had that and knew that his engines were running. And there was some other stuff, communications things. Everything that I had written down got done.
And you know what? I talked to Chris Russell, who was the Wizzo. I don't know if you know this, Al. They had no close air support with troops in contact in any of their doctrine, didn't train to it. So his pilot, Kurt Rykoff, is putting bullets down on the mountaintop for the very first time in his career, 80 meters from the good guys. 80 meters from the good guys. All right.
Well, it's like, if you look at, there's a book that just came out called Swords of Lightning. It's the horse soldiers' perspective on their thing. And they were using B-52s and B-1s as a cast platform, which they don't train to.
No.
So we were
they
developing.
Do now.
Right. Yeah. But we were developing these things back then. And when people go, well, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do that? And it's like, well, first of all, there was only one drone in theater and one that was armed, and you had like another one that was, unarmed. That was all new. You mean you can talk line of sight through the drone to Arizona? Nobody did that. Yeah. So the lessons learned out of this thing were
huge.
Big learning curve.
Well, and fortunately, we were able to capture a lot of these before we went into Iraq. And many of us, Al, look back at this battle and Anaconda as here's what all went wrong. Let's make sure it doesn't go wrong again when we go into Iraq. And we changed.
Think of the simple thing. One of the simple things is this, right? So all of the airframes, the F-15, F-18, F-16, the B-52, the ground, the helicopters, all used different longitude, latitude coordinates. Some used minutes, some used seconds, some used tenths of minutes. And that was part of one of the friendly fire incidents, right? I remember the initial planning for Iraq. I was in one of the planning cells for that. They were coming up with how they were going to do stuff. And I said, wouldn't it be neat if we had a coordinate system that every military platform used that was the same, called the Military Grid Reference System?
Yep.
And we actually changed over to that because you never knew. And if somebody forgot to put tick marks on a regular lat long coordinate, you just didn't know sometimes.
Yeah.
Was that, and it can be, huge, 3/4 of a mile off.
We had this same thing bite us in the butt in Iraq, Al, because you guys use Blue Force Tracker. We used Falcon View, and they didn't talk to each other. And I remember being in the BCD, Al, holding up the two images from the different systems because we were trying to figure out what was shooting at the tankers in southern Iraq. And it was the MLRS systems. The Army's MLRSs were shooting over the tankers into Baghdad.
Oh, wow.
Because the two systems weren't talking to each other. Right. There was almost a frat on a tanker that got shot at 7 times in one night. And the gal that was doing all the Sapphire events, she said to me, she says, Saddam shot at Toga 3-3 3 times. You need to go talk to the Army about the other 4. And I went, what? And that's when we found out that problem. All right. And again, it was because the services weren't talking to each other. We weren't a joint force yet, like you were saying. We had communications issues during Anaconda. We had coordinate issues. There's just so many things. Okay. Because if the Air Force had known 2 weeks prior that this was going to happen, Al, we would have had a Predator over that valley and it would have parked there 24/7. And we would have known what was going on top of that mountain. And I think that's part of the problem of what happened here is we shouldn't have had to rely on the nails, the AC-130s. We would have had something overhead that would have seen all of that stuff going on.
Right.
How can you miss a donkey tied to a tree?
Right. But you got to remember now, this is what I was saying is that, what we're used to seeing now is not what it was like back then. It was very primitive. You didn't get, to get a pred feed would be like you had to go to the skiff. Nowadays, in any planning area, there's big screen TVs everywhere. I used to, when I went to Iraq, so I stayed mostly in Afghanistan until about 2006. And then I ended up in Iraq until we kind of collapsed that there and went back to Afghanistan. But my routine in both places, once the infrastructure was built out like that, was I'd be the first one up. I'd go over to the planning area, get my cup of coffee, and then I would read the daily misreps and Sapphire events, right? So who's getting shot at by what and where, and I would plot them. And then I've ended up putting those in an email where you could just click on it and a Google Earth file would show up. So you didn't have to look. Yeah. And I would do that. And then I would walk over to the intel section and I'd say, hey, of these feeds up here, which one are you guys thinking might be tonight's target? And they'd be like, Pred number 3. And I'd go back and I'd plot the coordinates, from that. And I'd start watching it while I'm having my coffee. I'd just get a distance and time. Like, okay, that'll take me 30 minutes to get there. It looks like I don't have any weight restrictions. And that way, when everybody else comes in, I go, hey, they're looking at that. Here's what I'm thinking. And then everybody else would have their coffee. And then I'd go talk to the ground force later on in the morning and go, what do you think? And they go, well, how long do you think it would take you to get here? Like, that's 37 minutes, 30 seconds. And they're like, how do you know that? I'm like, pilot stuff.
That 88 navigate communicates.
Right. But that's the kind of stuff you do now, right? And back then you just didn't have that.
No.
And the bandwidth, just to get imagery, back then was huge. Terrible. Right?
Yeah. We had terabyte lines coming into the Kayak and I still don't think we had enough.
Right.
We had 6 U-2s and like 9 Predators flying on the opening night of Shock and Awe. And that was too much information. That was too much going on because now you have to sift through it all too, but that was one of the things that we learned.
And whenever we did a big target,
they
would put a fixed wing platform overhead, ABCCC, right? Airborne command and control.
Yep.
They didn't have all they were doing was on the radio. They didn't have sensors to look at.
Yeah.
And eventually that was kind of like, oh, that's kind of dumb. We can just be back in the jock or the talk, watching feeds.
Well, and the Joint Stars airplane had some really good capability of looking at all the things that were coming down highways and anything that was any kind of movement to a certain threshold. And again, all of this stuff is feeding into us. I remember in the J-Stars feed, if it's a potential target, it's a upside down yellow triangle. And when it's confirmed, it goes right side and red, goes right side up and red. And the first night we saw these triangles going boop, 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 all over everywhere. And it's mensured targets, mensured coordinates. So we could actually go drop on it. It was just amazing watching all that happen. But now I hear it's even more cosmic. Okay. More cosmic. So anyway, so now you're flying through Iraq and everything in 2006 timeframe. So you're still doing kind of the same things. You're doing all the planning, all the flying, and you're the most senior Chinook guy at the Night Stalker. So obviously there's some really cool missions that are going on with, we're hunting bin Laden, Saddam now, some really cool stuff too, I'm sure.
Yeah. So they already had Saddam by the time I got there, but we were chasing Zarqawi. He was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is now ISIS. He was the guy that cut off Daniel Pearl's head, the journalist.
Yeah.
And even Zawahiri said, he's too evil for us.
Wow.
He's a bad guy. Yeah.
That's crazy. So Al, tell my listeners what those helicopters went on to do.
So the aircraft that I described earlier in Operation Anaconda was tail number 499. That aircraft was an MH-47E Echo. And I had flown that earlier in the year at Tora Bora chasing Osama bin Laden. And the air mission commander on that aircraft was a young captain on his first deployment. Later on, that aircraft went into refit and came out as a MH-47G, right, with the Rockwell cockpit.
Yeah.
That aircraft, that tail number, was then flown by that young captain, who's now a lieutenant colonel in this case, and it carried bin Laden's body out of Abbottabad. So if you talk about some bookends there, you got aircraft at Tora Bora, then Abbottabad, and the same young captain is in there. And then the other story was 476 was the aircraft I was shot down in Anaconda. That aircraft was subsequently recovered and then refit and then put back into combat about 8 months later. I was the first one to fly it in combat again. And I was with a bunch of SEALs from the same group that, Roberts had been with. And, we're sitting around waiting to do a mission, and the Master Chief comes up and says, "Hey, Chief, you ever crashed before?" I said, "Yeah, I got shot down in this helicopter right here." At it, like, this is the one? This is the Roberts Ridge aircraft? Yeah. So it was nice to see that thing back in action.
That's amazing, man. That's an amazing story that both of these helicopters are these bookends at later on in their lives. That's phenomenal stuff. Okay. I'd like to get the kind of the wife's perspective on this thing too. How did your wife find out that you were involved in this and what happened?
At the time, my wife thought, first of all, there was only 4 Chinooks in country, but CNN broke the news and they said, 2 MH-47 Chinooks out of Fort Campbell were shot down. There's 8 KIA. Well, if there's only 4 aircraft, each of those pairs of 2 have a flight lead in them. There's me and one other guy. The 8 people, that's 2 crews. And even though that's not how it really worked out, that's what she heard. So she figured I was dead, and then she didn't hear anything. And I did have the opportunity on a sat phone. The CIA rep at the Gardez handed to me and said, "Hey, the story's about to break on CNN. You might want to call your wife and tell her you're okay."
Oh, no.
And I said, "No, I can't, because all the wives have been hanging out, and if my wife knows it's not me, then we know it's the other guy. And then, so by the process of elimination, somebody finds out before the proper notification." So when she found out that I had an opportunity to call her, she never forgave me for that.
Oh, no.
Never.
Hopefully you two are beyond that now. But I think any wife would have been pissed like that,
Yeah. But the thing is, I've been in the unit when there were deaths, and you got to let the actual notification process happen.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure when Extortion 17 went down, that must have been very tough on your unit, not only your unit, but with all the guys that were in the back too. Hey, brother, we've been going for a long time here. I cannot thank you enough for being on with me today, brother.
No, thanks. It's a pleasure.
Al, this was great. And there's so much cool information that you gave us, particularly from being inside that helicopter and going up to the top of the mountain as Razor 3. And this is just...
Yeah, and you can learn, I'm sure I forgot to mention a lot of stuff, in the course of the conversation, but you can always read more in my book, Razor 03 at Night Stalker's Orders.
Perfect. Yeah. And folks, I encourage my audience, when that book comes out, Razor 3, you've got to go out and read this book. there are a lot of things that Al probably didn't tell us that'll probably be in the book. And you got pictures in the book also, I'm sure?
There is pictures, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for being on with us, Al.
All right, see ya. It was a pleasure.
All right. I want all of you to understand, the Night Stalkers never sleep. These guys and gals are deploying all over the world, constantly flying these helicopters into some really dangerous places, inserting our special ops guys and those from other nations into places where some really bad guys live. I want all of you to go out and pre-order the book Razor 3, A Night Stalker's Wars by Al Mack. And you'll hear a lot more stories about the things that he's been involved with, as well as what the Night Stalkers do. Al was there for 17 years, so he knows a lot about what the Night Stalkers do. There is no helicopter unit on the face of this planet that flies like these guys and gals do. The Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 helo drivers. That's why I asked Al, how do you get into this group? The Lessons from the Cockpit show gets its financial support from Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. And please, folks, go take a look at the ready to print. There's 116 ready to print images right now, and I'm working on the 160th source Chinook, so they'll be in the ready to print section pretty soon. These are incredibly detailed and incredibly researched images for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. They come in 4, 6, and 8 feet. We also do custom images where we put your name, weapons load, the unit you're from, tail numbers, all those kinds of things on the image. Please share this episode and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit show with your family and friends, and you can find all of my previous shows on my website at markhasera.com. On next week's show, we're going to talk to Greg, who Al mentioned several times while he's been talking. Greg Calvert was flying Razor 1, and most of the casualties from the Battle of Roberts Ridge were from his helicopter. He had 4 guys killed in his helo before they even were able to get Nate Self and the Rangers Quick Reaction Force out of the back of the helicopter. Thanks for coming by and listening. Please download this and other episodes found on my website, markhasera.com, and we'll look forward to talking to you again next week.